Anything that I can drill a hole in the bottom can become a planter.
The rhododendrons are great for wildlife. The bumblebees, the tiger swallowtails.
When we did move here, this was just a hayfield.
When you're out deadheading, it gives you that inner peace. If it's a bad day, get out in the garden.
Hello and welcome to Great Gardening. I'm your host, Sharon Young, and tonight we have a special hour-long episode. We're in the midst of the growing season and we can't wait to share gardening tips and tricks with our audience. As usual, we have our garden experts with us. They are horticulturist and educator Bob Olin and garden professional Deb Burns-Erickson. We want to hear from gardeners across the region who have questions for our experts. Phone volunteers are here to receive your questions as well as accept pledge donations during our programming this evening. Call us at 218-788-2844 or email us at ask@pbsnorth.org. Let's talk about our current conditions. We have video from the and although not everything is in bloom, we still see some beautiful sights.
Oh, tulips.
Tulips, there.
Tulips. Yeah, you guys have been cold for those
Such
to be
a
out.
spectacular location. I mean, we're just so blessed and fortunate to have that beautiful rose garden. So kudos to all the volunteers as well as City Duluth. And here, you know, it's just getting started. It's fantastic.
Sure, that is. More tulips. Yep.
Last summer, we visited the Duluth Japanese Peace Bell Garden, which is a feature of Enger Park. We spoke with co-chair Irina Haller, who enlightened us the significance and history of the garden.
My name is Irina Haller. I am a co-chair of the Duluth Japanese Peace Bell Garden Committee that is part of the Duluth Sister Cities organization. So everything had started with a bell that was brought to Duluth as a war trophy after the World War II. Eventually it was recognized as the bell that came from Ohara and was returned to the town of Ohara. And as the appreciation of the return bell, we received a sister bell that is at the end of this path. So in 2005, we had a conversation right here by the bell of creating a traditional Japanese garden as the authentic environment that surrounds the bell. There are 4 essential elements of every Japanese garden. The backbone of the garden is the stone. All of the stones around the garden actually come from around the Enger Park. That's very important in creating the Japanese garden, connecting the old to the new. The next element would include man-made objects. Right behind me, the entryway is made from the reclaimed redwood. There are also pagoda, stone pagoda and stone lanterns, the bridge over the dry creek. So all of these elements, including the bell, have been made by humans. The third element are the plantings. This would not be your flashy, very colorful garden in terms of the color, but most of the other plants really allow to create the texture, the shapes, and the last element in every Japanese garden is water. All of the water that we have is symbolic, whether that is a dry creek that runs through the natural stone outcrop and then the Zen garden itself, which is filled with the granite chips and raked by the volunteers to represent the waves or maybe reflections of the clouds. So our goal was to really create an authentic environment around the bell, but also an educational space for people to learn about a different culture and experience that culture without leaving our town.
Bob, you wanted to talk about azaleas.
You know, the azalea series, in particular the Northern Lights series, has really changed our landscapes in northern Minnesota, northern Wisconsin, actually throughout the Midwest and up into Canada. The Northern Lights azaleas are just beautiful in the landscape right now, and even though it's late June or early June, the flowering has just been spectacular this year. It's part of the University of Minnesota's hardy plant breeding program, started back in the 1950s. Big shout out to Dr. Leon Snyder, who was really instrumental in establishing the hardy breeding program and bringing so many of these varieties into our northern climate. For the Northern Lights series, which was the first one that was introduced, that breeding actually started in 1954. Al Johnson was the original plant breeder, and kudos to that gentleman. He's no longer with us, but he really was so instrumental in this. Northern Lights was introduced, the first of the series, in 1978. So what's that, 24 years he worked on that introduction, crossing hardy native varieties with some from the farther south. And now we have about 14 varieties in the Northern Light series. And literally, as I mentioned, the Light series has changed our landscapes in the spring. Al Johnson was the original breeder. He doesn't get a lot of recognition or credit because he was followed up by Dr. Harold Pellett, marvelous individual as well, who was so responsible for introducing so many of these varieties in the Light series. And then Stan Hokanson, who's still working at the Arboretum, Department of Horticulture. Stan is still introducing new varieties. So you're going to see some like the Electric Light series, which is a double azalea that's just beautiful, but also hardy. You know, this is one of my favorite quotes from Winston Churchill: so much is owed by so many to so few. So there's so few plant breeders that have spread all of this beauty for us throughout our landscapes. And this year, they're absolutely magnificent. So they're not difficult to grow, really. They're hardy, they'll last a long while. You really want either full sun or partial shade. They don't like it really hot, so morning sun is really great, good drainage, and then maybe some afternoon shade. You want a soil, again, that is well drained. It's nutrient rich. So if you've got a light sand, let's get some good organics in there, some good compost in there, but it should be acidic, really a pH down around 5.5, which is blueberry territory. That's essential. So if we're going to fertilize, maybe we're going to fertilize twice a year. We're going to use an acidifying fertilizer. Right as the buds begin to break is probably the first fertilizer application. And then the second one right when the bloom begins to drop, maybe in another week or two here. And then you want to stop any fertilizing by August 1st. We really want them to settle down coming into the fall. But there are some water-soluble acidifying fertilizers. They're labeled for azaleas or blueberries. And if you don't have that, ammonium sulfate is available at many, many outlets, and that provides a little bit of nitrogen in the ammonia component, and the sulfur component will actually keep the pH low where we want that depressed. The pH of 4 or 5.5 is below our native pHs, which are typically about 6.5 to 6.8. Then the other thing I just want to caution people about, you really want to protect from deer. The deer just love those blooms as they come through the winter, and they're looking for something early in the season to munch on before the grass gets out there and lush and green. So protect from that. The Northern Lights, this is the original. It's still one of the very best. That's hardy down to about 40 below. And so it grows from here well up into Canada. And this was one of the originals, the Mollis azalea. We have a few of these in our landscapes, which are really cherished. This was noted for that orange color, but also it was very, very hardy. So it was part of the breeding history, really, of the Northern Lights series. But now in the series itself, we have so many others that are just spectacular in terms of color. Apricot Lights, I think, very appropriately named. And if you ever get the opportunity, here's the flower of Apricot Lights, just absolutely spectacular. There's a very, very nice azalea garden down at the Minnesota Landscape Arboretum. You want to take that in. Pink Lights, another in the series that's very, very outstanding and attractive. Spicy Lights has some additional color that goes along with that, some striations. So they each have a unique characteristic, but all relatively easy to maintain. White Lights, that white along with the Northern Lights, that combination of white and that real beautiful pink color of the Northern Lights is just spectacular. Here they just spread very nicely. Again, they do not take a lot of care. They'll take a little bit of pruning, but just keeping the soil acidic and keeping the deer away, and they'll be with you for, who knows, 30, 40 years. And just, they're also a wonderful source of nectar for the pollinating insects, which we're all aware of are so important. So spectacular series. They're in bloom right now. You can look at UMB's campus. They surround their introduction into the actual campus itself. So enjoy them and consider planting some of them in the future because they really are beautiful.
Thank you, Bob. That was a great quote, too. Thank you for sharing. Now it's time for some questions. Jerry in Duluth is wondering how to keep the deer away from the tulips and the vegetables.
Just what you talked about. You know, I'm a big fencer.
Fence.
If you really have to. The tulips, you know, you really want to screen those off. There are a lot of repellents. If you're going to use repellents, many can be quite effective, but mix them up.
Rotation, yeah.
Rotation on a regular basis, and then if you can fence some of the outside areas, perimeters of the property, that's the ultimate solution.
Great. Kathy in International Falls has a question about sweet potatoes. Can she get sweet potatoes from a sweet potato vine?
Sweet potato vines do have sweet potatoes at their base. They're not, I've had them, they're not very tasty. They're a little fibrous and there's not a lot of flavor to them. They're not very big, but you will get a tuber from it. And the funny thing is, if you keep the tuber for next year, you will not get the same sweet potato to come from it. You won't get the lime green, you won't get the dark foliage.
color.
You'll get a native type that comes back.
Yeah, this is so true. The ornamentals were bred really for their beautiful appearance and not for the quality of the actual tubers. So you really have to go to the varieties. Georgia Jet is still my favorite in northern Minnesota, northern Wisconsin. And, you know, if you can get the Georgia Jet, put it out another week or two, that's going to be a good one for edibility, but not necessarily the ornamentals.
Not the ornamentals.
No.
Great. We have an email from Jason from Cloquet. What can be planted, either annual or perennial, to help keep the mosquitoes away?
Okay, so a lot of people have been coming to the greenhouse looking for the mosquito citronella type geranium, which is a nice geranium, has good fragrance, and generally people plant things that have fragrance, but you kind of have to rough them up to use them. But they're really a disguise of your breath and the attraction for mosquitoes. There are some different herbs people have used, lavender, with pretty good success. And then supposedly mosquitoes hate the citrus smell, and that's why they go for the citronella geraniums and anything with a lemon fragrance. There's even some lemon plectranthus that's on the set there in front of you, and it's got a light fragrance to it, but it's all about the fragrance and disguising you. So anything with a strong fragrance.
And it would have to be very strong to keep the
There's
mosquitoes
a lot. The
down
pest
this
pressure
year.
is very high.
It was huge this year and still is, yes.
Sure. Mary from Duluth wants to know if people can purchase fruit trees from St. Louis County Extension. If so, how? If not, where do you buy your fruit trees? She used to get an order form in the mail.
Yeah, you know, St. Louis County Extension really doesn't have any program where they're retailing any type of plant material. We let our private industry handle that, but we do have a lot of recommendations, and fruit trees can really be obtained from our local nurseries. And you know, they've been a little bit short supply because there's been tremendous interest, and they might be, by the time that gets to the retail location, they might be 7, 8, 9, 10 years old already. So they really didn't anticipate this type of demand to increase production. So they've been a little short supply, but they're available locally, certainly.
Right, and for production, you want ones with a good caliper that are good size, because you'll get fruit on them. We get fruit on ours every year in the pot. So if they're a good mature one, for a good mature.
I think that's great. The other thing is buy locally, and this is a situation where I've seen a lot of these same varieties, but grown farther south. So they're grown fast, and they just really don't stand up. So talk with your local dealer and get materials. We've got a great wholesaler in the Twin Cities that developed a lot of the materials from the University of Minnesota. But make sure that product, you don't want to really shop for price on this.
True.
You want to shop for quality, really, and not just the cultivar name, but where was it grown? Was it grown? A lot of these were grown right in Minnesota at a major range just out of St. Paul. So talk with your dealer. Spend the extra money on a quality tree. It'll pay off over the next 30, 40, 50 years.
Great advice, Bob. So a viewer has rhubarb that has fungus on the leaves, but the stalk looks okay. Is it still okay and safe to eat?
it's safe to eat. I'm sure you're not going to eat the leaf anyway. It's going to be fine, totally fine. It's rhubarb.
Right. And the leaves is where the oxalic
Yeah,
acid
so you don't want
is.
to touch them anyway.
There's something worse in there than just a little bit of fungus on
Yeah.
there. So cut all that off anyway, and the stalks, there shouldn't be a problem.
Great.
Yep.
Jen in Duluth bought an apple tree last year, and this winter 2 side branches partially broke off. Can she bind them back up? She's not aware of the kind of tree.
Sure. I mean, you might
She
as well try.
can.
You have nothing to lose if you just try to do it, and everything to gain if
Right.
you actually heal it.
The only little difficulty, make sure that you don't have a split that'll carry water into the main core of the
Disease.
tree. Yeah. If you get rot in the center portion of the tree, that can be a problem. But if she can get that, there's
Tight.
a cambium layer. If she can squeeze it together tight, and oftentimes you'll actually bolt it together with a threaded bolt and pull things together that way. So if you can do it that way and get that cambium layer to line up, they can heal. Very definitely.
Okay, I have 2 questions about azaleas. Shirley from Proctor wants to know if you can cut azaleas down to the ground, and Linda in Brimson wants to know, how do you prune the Northern Light azaleas?
You know, that's one thing. They're real woody. You're never going to cut them to the ground because they're not going to come back for you at all. But you can prune them, after the bloom. You can carefully cut them back and shape them a bit, cut back to another junction. But don't be very aggressive. They're not like a cut back shrub that will come back and flourish. So you want to prune very carefully and not more than maybe 10 or 15%.
Very selective.
Very
selective.
Tim in Duluth is wondering if there's a podcast that you recommend that will help encourage and learn about vegetable growth.
Ooh.
Joe Lample.
what's the name?
What is his gardening one? But he has the show A Greener World on PBS. He has a wonderful, fantastic podcast, and it's Joe Lample, Growing a Greener World, and I can't remember what his exact podcast, but it's all linked. He has a website with it, and he's been doing PBS for years. It's fantastic.
Great. Kevin from Deer River is wondering how he can eliminate potato bugs.
You got any good ideas
No,
there?
Bob. No, Bob.
It's one of the real challenges that we have, particularly after a winter like this, because they overwinter in the soil and there was so much protection for them. You just want to eliminate as many as you can. If you have a few plants, just handpick continually. I've shared this with people before. It sounds a little crazy, but I'll open up a small area. You're snow blowing the driveway, take all the snow off that garden bed, and your neighbors are going to wonder if the winter's gotten
crazy.
you half crazy. But it's that open, exposed soil and that cold penetration that will actually kill that larvae that's in the soil, or pupae, I believe it is, in the soil at that particular time. We do not have, the homeowner does not have a lot of good pesticide controls, even if they wanted to use them.
Okay, well, thank you. Shortly, we are going to ask for your support to help keep programs like Great Gardening on the air. But first, let's continue highlighting unique gardens in our region. Our next one is run by the Gichigumi Garden Club, which is part of the Duluth Garden Flower Society. It's community built and grown, and we can't wait to share it with you.
My name is Ann Fink. We are at 60th Avenue East, and I think it's London Road, but I think it's probably Congdon, because it switches right there at that corner. Gichigumi Garden Club, which is part of the Duluth Garden Flower Society. Every club in the society is required to have a garden on a public space in Duluth, and this is where we chose to have ours. A friend of mine, Dale Hurst, and I started it in 1999. We are still an active group. A lot of the clubs in the society are aging out, and they have stopped gardening in the parks where they had gardens. Our climbing hydrangea, which climbs up the cottonwood tree at the middle of the garden, it's not quite still in bloom right now. We planted it almost at the beginning of when we started this garden, which was in '99, and we're guesstimating it's about 60 feet tall now, because nobody's climbing up there to measure it. We have some bee balm. We have hosta that the deer enjoy. In order to maintain the garden, we have probably 6 active members, sometimes 7 or 8, which we really love. We had some trouble with the water meter this year. The handle on it wasn't working right, but we now have a very nice handle for arthritic hands, so we love that. When we are here as a group to do either a spring cleanup or a fall cleanup, the neighbors come by. Sometimes they're just driving by when one person is here cleaning, and they'll yell out the car, "We love the garden. Thank you for all your work keeping it up. It's beautiful." And that just gives you more potential to keep at it and keep it going.
Welcome back to Great Gardening. We have more to show you tonight, including Deb talking about dahlias and showing off your sent-in photos with the local dirt. But first, let's get back to some questions. Lisa Lou in Ganesan Township has deer eating blooms off the blooming crab. Does this damage the tree? They're getting through all sorts of netting types. Are there any other deterrents?
Deer issues. Does it damage the tree? Well, you know, you obviously don't want too much damage. You don't want too much foliage that's being reduced there, so it isn't any good for the tree. But you know, getting back again, some of the light netting isn't going to work for you. Certainly an apple tree, you can get a good sturdy fence. It's going to have to be, you know, about 7-8 feet in height, and will have to extend beyond the reach of the branches. But good solid metal fencing with T-posts in the ground is probably going to be your best bet. Electric fencing will work, but not during the winter months when we really have to watch that out. Different repellents potentially if you wanted to rotate them, but it's a challenge other than good, strong metal fencing.
Okay. Mary Jo emailed us about her 6-year-old Honeycrisp apple tree that has great pollination this year. It's a 9 to 10 foot tall, 6 foot diameter and healthy, and each cluster of fruit has between 5 to 7 apples forming about 1/4 to 1/2 inch in diameter. Many of the branches have 3 to 5 clusters of fruit, and it was in full bloom on May 22nd. Can she thin the fruit, and how many per cluster should be left to mature on the tree? Pinch or cut? Mary Jo from Hibbing.
Well, Deb, we take a look at I did a little work on that at one time, and we've had so much bloom this year, and we had a light year last year. So many trees are carrying way too much fruit, so you're definitely going to have to thin. The tree will shed a little bit of it naturally, but not nearly enough. So she's going to take it down at a bare minimum. You know, apple trees have got a fruit spur that the blossoms form off of, and ultimately the fruit. So you want to get down to 1 fruit per spur. Actually, she's going to take off even more than that. And we found that actually about a tree will support 20, it takes about 20 leaves to support 1 good quality fruit. So you're not going to count all 20 out, but count 20 out so you have a little idea of what that is, thin everything else out. It's going to be real hard to do, particularly for people like yourself that really love those plants, but you're going to have to remove some of that fruit, and the tree will thank you for that. There can be structural damage to that tree if you leave all of that on. And then if you do leave it on, you're going to get a heavy fruit load this year, but it's going to be very, very light next year. So try to thin that out and even out the fruit load.
Great. Shelley wants to know the best way to get grass out of an existing flower bed. She's tried pulling it out, but it just keeps coming back.
Oh, it's just creeping in.
Yeah, that rhizomatous grass is tough.
It's tough to control.
You know what she'll do maybe in the early spring is lift, you know, if these are perennials,
pull everything.
Lift everything
Pull it
out,
out.
let it sit temporarily, get in there, and your choice. You could either use a non-selective herbicide, glyphosate or Roundup is one of the potential products, or dig everything out. Every one of those underground rhizomes has to come out, and then you replant the roots or the tubers from the perennial material. That's the way to clean it up. Selectively is really difficult to do it any other way.
And then put a barrier around it that will
around
help
the
slow it
outside.
down. Yeah, once you get it all cleaned up, then put that barrier in.
Right, and once again, you don't want to be cheap on the barriers. Get a good commercial grade that's going to cost you a little bit more money, because the less expensive barriers really don't stand up at all.
And you're just going to be doing it again.
And it won't be very effective at all.
Great tip. Alan in Embarrass, Minnesota knows it's early, but he planted some apple trees, Honeycrisp, Frostbite, Norland, and was wondering about protection for the winter.
Oh, great. Deer protection. Right,
Here we go.
We just talked about that. Number one, and then he wants a cylinder around them.
A nice size one.
Nice size one, 6-8 inches. You can use just black drainage tile. It'll absorb some of the sun, but as long as that black plastic column doesn't come in touch with the bark, as soon as that bark expands or the trunk expands, you have to get those collars off. So it might be 5 or 6 years down the road, but just don't let them grow to that contact point, because there's damage that can occur there. So the main stem needs to be protected, and the entire tree needs to be protected from the deer damage with a good solid metal fence. Then you're in pretty good shape.
Yeah, just get a nice size one. Don't skimp and get a little collar to go around.
Yeah, don't worry about it. Actually, just buy the drainage tile, slit it down, and I'll share this with you because I've put many of these on. Don't try to cut it with an aviation snip or anything. Get in there with just a small handsaw and slit it right down the drainage line, and they'll open up pretty nicely for you. But get them off. And then you really don't need to stake. Later in the fall is when we're staking a lot of trees, because we don't have the opportunity for the root system to get developed. You really want that tree to sway in the wind, because that's what develops the strength of the bark. So early in the season like this, you don't need to stake them, but you do need to get a collar around there, a column around there, and then you need to protect from deer, and do that as soon as you put the tree in the ground. I made the mistake of planting the trees and assuming I could do it the next morning, put the deer fence around, and I think they watch you, because I've had damage that's actually occurred that rapidly.
Yeah.
Yes.
Be prepared when you get a tree to just do it.
Buy the fencing when you buy the tree.
Great. Rich in Superior mentioned that last week you were talking about rabbits eating bark off a tree. He has a white hydrangea bush with 4 trunks, and rabbits have eaten most of it. Will it survive?
Oh, it'll come back. Absolutely. It'll come back from the rootstock. Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. You can cut out that dead material that's above the, where they've girdled it, and that'll help it flush out quicker.
This, the hydrangeas, particularly when they bloom on new wood, they're totally different than our Northern Lights azaleas that you don't want to cut back. These you can really cut,
hard.
Take to the ground, cut hard, and they'll come back, particularly early in the season like this.
Yep.
Good. That's good news for Rich. So Deb, let's talk about dahlias.
Let's talk about dahlias. And dahlias were first discovered by Anders Dahl. So it is Dahlia. I've always said Dahlia, and I am completely wrong. So Anders Dahl, and he is Swedish, and he discovered them in Mexico. And so when we take care of dahlias, we should think of Mexico and emulating that kind of situation for growing them successfully. And there are at least 3 varieties: seed dahlias, which you can start from seed in mid-March, and then they will start to bloom in June. And they're smaller in stature, the seed ones are, but you get a variety of color. They get 10 to 12 inches tall, and they're really nice for a border. And just because they're a seed doesn't matter. They will turn into a bulb, a tuber in the fall. And then the second one is a herbaceous dahlia, which is a cutting dahlia, which they've done beautiful breeding for these dahlias. And there are so many choices that really the sky's the limit for color. And you can start those in early February, and they will start to bloom then in April to September. And they can range from anywhere from 10 inches to 36 inches tall. And they, like this one, the Illusion Yellow that's on the screen, is great for the main part of a container, the Thriller. And it's a bit easier to maintain in a garden bed as far as water, because they do drink a lot of water when it gets hot. And then the third is a tuber, which is, this one here is a dinner plate dahlia. And we start our tubers in early March. We put them in a container, and then we just water them well the first time, and then just wait for it to sprout. And then they will bloom June through September. And just don't worry about the dinners, because they take longer, because it's a huge blossom, and it just takes a lot longer for that plant to generate the energy to make that giant ball. And then they will get 24 to 36 inches tall easily, and a lot of foliage weight. And so a lot of times you're going to need either a really large container or really good bracing on it. And then dahlias are the best of both worlds, because everybody wants a perennial that blooms all summer. That every day someone's coming to the greenhouse going, I want a perennial that's good. Well, that's an annual, sorry. So, but a dahlia will give you that. It will bloom all summer long, and then you just pull the tubers in the fall, and then you can have tubers for a long time, and you can start to divide the tubers and have a lot of them. And then as far as care goes, during the summer, they love 6 to 8 hours of morning sun, or they really don't want that hot 2 o'clock to 4 o'clock when it really gets hot and the foliage can scorch. And they need recovery, so a cool down period. So just don't put them where they're going to really cook all day long. And then when you're transplanting them, you can put them deeper into the soil, but make sure you water them well, you water the hole well, and then you stick them in and water it really well because your roots have just been put down. I mean, you can go 4 to 6 inches deeper than what they've been growing at, and then it just stabilizes really nicely. And then you might also need an additional cage for the larger varieties, especially the dinners, because they get so big. And then the more you cut the blossoms, the more they're going to bloom, because once they start to signal that they're going to seed, and some of them will go to seed, but if you cut them, then they won't, and they'll just keep producing because that's their drive, is to produce a seed and to bulk their tubers. And watch again for sunburned leaves, like this one on there, is too much hot sun and possibly a lack of water. And then also, though, that picture could be either too wet or too dry. They look identical, and you really need to put your finger in that soil. You need to check it, and then do not overwater it, because then you could get a fusarian wilt, and there's no coming back from that. Then you're going to need to dig it up and dry it out. And the tubers, so digging the dahlia tubers, at the first site of damage from frost, you can lift them with a spade, a fork, a pitchfork type, lifts really well. And then you can lift them and let them dry on the soil a bit. And you can also, I was discussing this with a customer today, and I said, you can also leave them in your container. If your container is big enough to support that dahlia, you can actually just take that container in and put it in a spot that goes between 40 to 50 degrees and 70% humidity. But the customer said, well, what if I just pot up that dinner plate back into a container and then bring it in? I'm like, well, then you're ahead, because in the spring, in March, you can pull it out and it's already ready to go. And it would have wintered really, really well that way too. And then if you're digging it out, just lift it again, like I said, and let it dry, and then the location 70 to 80% humidity, which seems high, but you really don't want them to dry out. And then we like to use wood shavings or bedding, and not really vermiculite, because if vermiculite does get wet, it will stay wet. And it's a bit finer, so it gets in those areas and could cause them to start to rot. And then again, if it's just too much work, go back to your local greenhouse and get a fresh one in the spring. And you could have them for years and years and years.
Thank you so much, Deb. Let's get back to some questions. Nancy emailed us and has grown asparagus for years very successfully. Last year discovered plants covered with asparagus beetle. She picked them off as recommended and drowned them in soapy water. This year they are back in full force. What can she do to get rid of them?
Oh boy, that again, like Colorado potato beetle, it's for the homeowner, it's a real challenge. We just don't have products that will control it, and I wish I had a real good answer for her. Picking them off, it seems laborious, and it is, but she wants to try to do that. Maybe we're going to have to think a little harder on that and come up with some kind of a non-chemical control, some way of retaining them down in the soil, because once again, that pupa is down in the soil, and it was a really, really good year for any insect that was overwintering in the soil, so she may not expect this to continue. As soon as we get an open winter without a lot of snow cover early, and they will come along, that will do a lot to eliminate the population. So as with so many insects, Deb, you notice just when you can hardly stand them and you think it's, they're going to consume everything, they hit a population peak and their numbers begin to decline. So I wouldn't get overly discouraged, but I don't have a real good control for her.
Thank you. So in just a short time, we're going to ask for your support to keep programs like Great Gardening going. But first, let's check out your sent-in photos with the local dirt.
Let's see what's growing in your neighborhood with the local dirt. Colette from South Range, Wisconsin sent us these photos. Renee from Kettle River, Minnesota also sent us these lovely blooms. Send us photos from your gardens. Email us at greatgardening@pbsnorth.org, and it could show up on our air or Instagram feed.
Let's wrap things up with more questions. Sherry in Superior has bought foxglove plants last year. The label said they were perennial, but they're not growing this year. Do they grow later, or might it really be a biannual? They did bloom.
Right, they are biennial, but then some of the breeding has led to more perennials. But I did have a few people say that they had trouble with it, and they're not the easiest. There's the tap root, and sometimes something gets to that tap root, and I'm going to guess something got to it because it should come back.
Yeah, with the snow it should come back, but as you say, if that was the second year, of the biennial, and it didn't really have those perennial characteristics, so
But if it said perennial, I would guess on the tag it should have been.
They might have been stretching it a little bit.
Yeah, maybe.
There's a viewer that lives close to Spirit Mountain and wants to know if you can recommend a boxwood suitable for a garden.
A boxwood?
Boxwood.
You mean the plant boxwood?
The shrub.
Shrub?
Must be, yeah.
Okay. Well, if they're close to Spirit Mountain, there is some hardiest issues, but I think they should do just fine there, really. There's going to be lake effect, and you should be able, we have boxwood that does grow where there's lake effect, so I don't think there'd be difficulties. Just common boxwood should be fine.
Okay. Bill from Cloquet wants to know, why does everything seem to grow better and faster after lightning?
Nitrogen. It's nitrogen. Lightning, we had sod fields, and after a lightning storm, the sod just turned beautifully green.
This is nature's way, nitrogen, 4/5 of the air, approximately what we're breathing, is very stable. 2 nitrogens, the lightning comes down, the presence of oxygen splits that nitrogen, you get nitrate. And nitrate's the form of nitrogen that the plant wants, so you get that carried in with the moisture, and the plant gets a real shot of nitrogen.
Who knew we had Bob the science guy, right?
It's fun, the nitrogen
It
cycle
is.
and what we've learned there for sure. But that's nature's way of putting nitrogen in the ground.
Vicki in Duluth has had green beans in her garden, but something has been chewing them.
Ooh.
She sprayed with BT today, but what else can she do?
I've had that same experience, and we talked about it was a good winter, hard winter for a human being, but a very good winter for soil insects, or insects that spend their life cycle in the soil. That is seed corn maggot. I've got some major plantings that's taken out probably 50% of the planting, so all she can really do is replant. There's plenty of time. Replant, and oftentimes that insect goes through its life cycle, so she shouldn't be bothered the second time. Her crop's going to come just a little bit later. But forget about all the pesticides, and BT in particular, that will have no impact at all. Replant.
Good advice. We have a viewer that wants to know why they're having such a problem growing a gardenia. Is it the dirt or the size of the pot?
Gardenia. So they're growing it indoors, obviously, because the gardenia is not hardy at all. And so, is it the size of the pot? How big is the pot? What is the soil that they're using for the gardenia? And we don't have the best climate for it,
And light, southern exposure to get
Yeah,
in
lots
more
of
light?
sun,
Yeah.
lots of sun.
Agnes in Ashland has a 10-foot cedar trees, and the branches lower to the ground are gray and look dead. Is there anything they can do to revive the branches?
They're naturally going to shed those lower branches anyway, the older branches, and there was a lot of winter damage from the heavy snow loads that we had, so I don't think that made it any easier, but I wouldn't be too concerned about lower branches that are being affected. They're going to be dropped anyway.
Well, that's all for Great Gardening tonight. You can follow us on our social media channels, on Instagram at Great Gardening PBS North, and on YouTube at youtube.com/greatgardening, where you can find tonight's episode posted tomorrow. Thank you so much, Bob and Deb. It was awesome tonight with you.
Thank you, Sharon. It was a nice evening.
We'll be back for more Great Gardening later this year. But until then, from all of us here at Great Gardening, we'll see you next time, and please enjoy the garden.